Okay, welcome to the book club. You may begin.
I'm Jonathan Epps. Thank you to Marcus for having me on. I've written a couple of working on a dystopia. You were kind enough to have me on. You've read one of my books, and you're kind of in the middle of another one, and we're just going to talk about it. We're going to chill and talk about whatever comes to mind.
Cool. Okay, so I sent you some questions, and we can go in semi-order. First, tell us about yourself.
I just turned 45. Um, I'm from New Jersey originally. Jonathan Epps is not my real name. But I will not be divulging my real name. My real name is so Anglo. My line is it's so Anglo as anodyne. It's just such a Joe Schmo name that it does not have any literary snap. And Jonathan Epps isn't that much better, but it is better. And also, I like the pseudonym. Oh, wow, I like having a pseudonym. How's that? Um, because not that it's necessarily private, but it's kind of like it's like another version of myself that I can jump into. And if I don't have if I losing identity as a writer is actually very good. It's called negative capability when you can separate yourself from what you are writing and the characters you're writing about. It's actually a strength. You want none of your personal ego involved when you're writing a book, and so having a pseudonym kind of facilitates that distance.
Good. Can you describe your writing process?
The process is a process of discipline. It is of course it has to do you have to be inspired, you have to have an idea, you have to be compelled. For me, it's about compulsion. If there's something that I cannot stop thinking about, I have to coalesce it. And for me, the way I do that is through writing novels, and it's kind of an exercise, it's kind of an exorcism. It sort of gets the issue out of me, and then I can move on from something. But the process of writing is a daily habitual slog of self-discipline, and I try to do 1,000 words a day. No One Shall Last Forever took me 6 months to write, and that was a frenetic, obsessive process for me. I had just left teaching high school English. I had witnessed a troubled young man be misused um, in an administration that said they cared nothing about their only care was for the children, their only care is for the students, and yet when they have a troubled student, I saw exactly what they did, and they kicked him out as soon as they could. And he left in handcuffs saying he was going to kill everyone in the school. And I thought, well, the chances of him coming back, and there's one section of the book that is that story. And it's the only part of the book that's true. It's when he flashes back, when he has the memory of him, of having taught, and he retells the reader that story. That is based on truth. I obviously fictionalized it to disguise names because I'm not interested in exposing or doxing people. But it was a very particularly jarring episode in my life, and it was really disturbing. And I wanted to help that kid, and I was totally powerless, and that is a terrible feeling. This kid was 14 years old. He had reached out many times, and his cries were unheard. And then he lost it, and then he flipped out. And this is not to make any excuse for the young men who become psychotic. The psychosis is inexcusable. Obviously, the violence and the murder is inexcusable, and they deserve the fullest punishment under the law. But prior to, they are often helpless, intelligent, but helpless kids who are quite bullied. And the school, for all of its sociopathic, well, for all of its good talk about helping children and being there for children, there's a sociopathic effect in their lack of action, because they often do not help these kids, and they just want them out the door so that they don't have, so that they're not their problem anymore. And the same thing happened with the kid in the Florida school. I can't remember his name, and I don't remember the town. But anyway, there was a Florida shooting, and he was the same sort of profile. The profile isn't always the same, but the school shooters often have parallels in terms of their psychological description. Again, not excusing the psychopathy of mass murder. It is abhorrent, and these boys should be locked away for life if they take that step to do this. But again, prior to, I saw how the system is also complicit in facilitating some of this psychosis, and it's very bad stuff.
Yeah, it was a very compelling book. And so just the way the detail, the attention that you put into each scene was, keeping me on the edge. So with that little bit of information, thank you for sharing that. So what got you into writing and or storytelling?
I always wanted to be an artist. I always wanted to be a creative person, and it just sort of evolved this way. I started writing when I was 24. Um, it's a practice. It's something you have to work on. Very few people are just naturally gifted writers who can just sit down and write something incredibly readable and compelling. It is something that you have to do over and over and over again. The first novel I ever wrote is unpublished and will continue to be so. There are a lot of short stories that I wouldn't publish. There's a lot of work that is crap, that is not worth anyone's attention.
Right.
And that's true of any discipline. That's true of any practice. That's true of any profession. You have to do things over and over again until you get it right, until it's worthy of an audience. Yeah, it's just storytelling. I think it's a natural thing for most people. Everyone tells stories all day, every day, and it's a natural aspect of human being. What makes me want to have control over a narrative and specify character and specify action and sort of be the wizard of a world, I don't know. It's an interest I've had since I probably was first exposed to Shakespeare, in any kind of serious substantive way in college, where I was really studying this drama and what the structure of drama entails and why it's an interesting way to reflect the world as it is, to reflect human experience. I was just drawn in, and it
That's
was
good.
something related to my skill set. I don't have a tremendous amount of skill sets. I was an excellent high school English teacher, and I think I'm a pretty good novelist. But beyond that, I don't really know what my skills are.
Okay. So who or what was your inspiration?
I've read a lot of literature. I studied in college, and I continued reading it after the fact. And anyone from Herman Melville, Moby Dick, Typee, Bartleby the Scrivener, Billy Budd the Sailor. I mean, that is a heartbreaking short story. It's almost a novella. Just a fantastic author philosopher who was able to, I don't know, describe American experience in a way that illustrated the time in which he lived. To Toni Morrison, Song of Solomon is a brilliant novel. Song of Solomon is probably her best novel. If you haven't read that one, that's really great. She infuses Greek mythology into this Black American narrative about coming out of slavery in the 50s and trying to forge an identity that is able to assimilate to the white world. Well, her brother, Milkman, wants to assimilate into the white world because he wants to be a success. He wants to be a man in the world. His sister has more of an African soul, more of an maintains African culture, that spirituality, that sensuality that informs him, and she's sort of his keeper and protector along the way. And he has a best friend, Guitar, who is his foil. Guitar is very, very militant, very, very anti-assimilation, and they have a conflict that is basically the arc of the story. It's a brilliant book. Who else? I also like the English modernists. I love Virginia Woolf. I love Proust, who's a French modernist. I liked people who were able to delicately compose language in such a way that they illustrate a scene, they illustrate an emotion, a moment, a time in their lives or a time in anyone's life that is so vivid that though you are not an English aristocratic woman in 1910, you can absolutely feel what it's like to have been that. And that is the phenomenon of art. That is the phenomenon of literature.
So what's interesting is in a different interview I saw you uh, be a part of, you said that you were a late reader.
I was.
Let's explain that a little more. Because I find it interesting that you were a high school literature teacher, English teacher,
Yep.
and you're, I think profound is the right word, um, and passionate about reading in English. So does that coincide with you being a late reader?
Maybe.
Okay.
I don't know. I hated books. I hated to read when I was a kid. My mother was a goody two shoes boomer nerd. She was a straight A student and went to William and Mary and just foisted books onto me, and I absolutely hated. I also have a bit of an anti-authority streak in me. I hated being told what to do as a child. Um, I did love my children's books. I did love, The Little Engine That Could, The Very Hungry Caterpillar, Good Night Moon. Like these are, I was born in 78. So these were all very 80s children's books.
Right.
I absolutely loved. And I would look at them by myself in bed at night. And I couldn't read the text, but I just loved the story. And but I just hated to read. And then in fifth grade, I read one book. I read the Where the Red Fern Grows, which is about a little boy in the Ozarks who has two hounds. And the hounds sort of he's in isolation. He's in the middle of nowhere. He doesn't have a lot of friends. And the hounds become his brother and his sister because they're a brother and sister from the same litter. And they just grow up with him and they protect him and he loves them. And then the arc, the climax in the end is very tragic and very sad. And I devoured that book, but that was the only book in my childhood, actual novel, that I read and read intensely. It was not until 1819 in college that I actually started reading again. I was too distracted by drugs and partying and sex and having fun and just being a wild. I was kind of wild in my teenage years.
It was the 80s, right?
My teenage years were the 90s.
Okay, okay, okay.
I was a teenager when you were born, like 94, 95, 96. That's when I was a teenager. I was 18 in 96.
Okay. Hey, you're alive to tell the tale.
Right.
And I think that's the important thing and the funny thing at the same time.
Right.
Okay. I can't thank you for telling us about your inspiration and your writing process. Uh, are there any similarities between you and Uncle Jack in the book?
No, he's a heterosexual male. He was 10 years older than me when I wrote it, or more. The only similarity was there is a similarity. The one parallel is we were both high school English teachers or high school teachers. I don't think I specify his subject. And we were both his passion and obsession and frustration over the issue of mass shootings, particularly in schools. Well, absolutely, I shared that just deep disturbance. What is wrong with the culture? I mean, that's when I really started saying, what the hell is going on in this culture? What is wrong with this society? Because that did not happen when I was a kid. I mean, there have been mass shootings, I think, going back to the 1800s, but they were extraordinarily rare. And perhaps there's a correlation between availability to guns as well. I'm sure that plays a statistical factor as well. But it just wasn't common for people to be. I'm sure there were psychopaths. There have always been pathological personalities in society. They weren't doing that. And that was particularly grotesque, particularly just horrific. And I just didn't understand why schools were so inept at. I mean, one of his ideas in the beginning of the book is, how do we target them? How do we figure out who they are and go after them? And of course, it's a vigilante thriller, and that's exactly what he does. And that was my idea. I was like, why aren't we able to pinpoint who these person? Why don't we should profile these kids, not to lock them up, but just to make sure that we have our eyes on them and that they're getting the right nutrients as opposed to the wrong nutrients. And too often they get the wrong nutrients, which triggers their pathology even more. They're probably naturally inclined to a psychopathic thrust, but there's got to be a way that we can nurture them in such a way that instead of killers, they become politicians.
Right. Okay, so I guess that will kind of answers the sub question is, if it was yes, um, does the relationship between Uncle Jack and Penny reflect your personal life? But it's
No, yeah, I'm a gay man. She's my mom, I think. Penny is really based on my mom.
okay, okay, okay. I get it. I was like, she's your mom in the story, but it's not about you. Okay, I get
Yeah,
it.
no, it's not about me. He is definitely not me. Um, he's the kind of man I don't quite idolize, but I respect. Someone who I like people who take action. Now, the action he takes is tragic and illegal and not recommended.
Mhm.
But I do admire people who have that kind of verve, who have that kind of life force, where they really are not willing to accept the status quo, especially when the status quo has become so deranged and so decomposed. When moral, ethical sensibility becomes this almost irrelevance, we've got big problems. And I respect people who acknowledge that and then take action.
Okay, that sounds good. I guess the reason why I asked, I don't know you, but as I was reading, um, I guess any other fictional books that I've read, the main character, protagonist, antagonist, I feel like most authors don't really give their characters, I guess, life. Um, so as I was physically reading, but then also switching over to the audiobook portion, I felt myself being the main character or even some of the other characters because you feel, at least from my perspective, my point of view, if you're reading from Jack's perspective, it's you're him. And then if Penny comes into the picture, it's like, okay, the reader, you can see like, okay, she's feeling neglected. And if you're Luke, you become like this teenage, well, he's not even a teenager, he's 21 years old.
But he
But
acts
then
like
like exactly. And then your mind warps into being this 21-year-old man living at home in the group chat. And then if it's who are some of the even the other characters, it's like you feel them and it almost feels real. So that's why I had to ask, is this is this uh is this you? Do you feel connected to these characters? So but thank you for elaborating on that. Because it just felt so real. Does that make sense?
yeah, I mean that's a huge compliment. Look, like that is the compliment. That is the highest compliment I can get. That is why I'm writing these books. I'm writing these books so that I can make what I think is compelling real for other people. And it's a process of observation and neutral observation. I mean, I write about people that I am clearly not. I
Right.
mean, the landscaper, I mean, he's a Latin American man. I'm not a Latin American man. Um, you know, I you know what I'm saying? Like white men are not in publishing today. White men are not allowed to write about anything. No one is. I mean, there's this weird prohibition on people not being allowed to write about something other than what they are, and that's absurd to me. Now, there are people who do it poorly. there are people who do it offensively, and they should be justly criticized for it. I mean, they shouldn't be disallowed from doing it, but they should be criticized if they don't do it well. And if you're a writer worth your salt, or worth your weight in salt, you have to do it well. That's one of the pressures I put on myself. If I'm going to write this man who is not me, I must understand him as well as I possibly can. And you're never completely accurate. You're never, someone can always, criticism is essential to a writer, and it's welcomed. I welcome people criticizing me. I just don't like it when it becomes ad hominem, when it becomes personally, personal invective is tragically base. It's like because it adds nothing. It has no purpose. It's just you're just sort of expressing rage that is inapplicable to the subject. That's something you need to work out in a therapist's office. You have something pertinent to say about the way I wrote a particular character. Of course, that's an interest that I'm fascinated by that. I'm fascinated by criticism. So no, I'm not these people, and you have to be able. That's that negative capability. You have to be able to separate yourself out from the character that you're sketching, and if you're successful, then it feels real, and if you're not successful, then it falls flat. And for you to say that it felt real is a huge compliment. I'm sure I'm not successful every time. The dystopia that I'm writing now has a lot of characters. It's the biggest cast I've ever had in a book. And there are lots of different kinds of people from all different kinds of backgrounds. And having to keep track of the characterizations, and to such an extent that when I switch into each one that is very different from the other, that I don't lose the integrity of that person. And that requires discipline.
Very much discipline. And I'm glad you brought up the Latin
The
person.
landscape. Yeah.
Yeah, the landscaper, because I kind of forgot about that part in the book, but that's also a crucial moment in the book because that's where the turning point happens.
Right.
Even that was done well. It's a quick scene, but it gets you over the hump,
Right.
right? So yeah, everything was done really well. Um, Even the characters who were there for a short period of time. So
Some of those guys were based on students that I had had.
um, okay, here's an important question. But before we get to that important question, why Missouri? So it's like, I was like, okay, this takes place in Missouri. Random?
Random,
Okay.
fairly not totally random. I wanted to be Americana. I wanted it to be as neutrally American as possible. New York is, the East Coast, New York, that's where I grew up. It's its own thing. It's too distinct. LA was too distinct. I wanted it to be indistinct. I wanted it to be clearly America, but almost nebulous, almost to such an extent that people from New York, people from LA could impute their own experiences into it because it had this generalized American aspect to it. And the Midwest is a good facilitator of that.
That's good. Maybe that's why I connected with it because it was in Missouri, like in my home state. So it's like,
It's your home state.
right, I can, without taking like the issue at hand, like, oh my gosh, it's more so like I could pinpoint an area of where this could have taken place. Not the actual events, but like the
Generally.
after, right? Generally. There we go.
I did some research, geographical research. I did research the Ozarks because I had to know what the topography was. I had to know what the geographical terrain looked like in order to be able to write about it, especially that last scene in the park. I had to know what that park might more or less, because it's probably not exactly right, but it's generally true so that you can suspend your disbelief.
Right. I was thinking Southern Missouri baseball field, family. Like I'm saying small town, I think depending on who you're talking to, they think small town in very vast different scenarios. But there's the big high school, there's the patch of green grass, there's the baseball field, suburbia.
Right.
Okay, so the following question, the important question was, do you think shooting-centered video games influence or have a direct influence on teen boys as a whole?
Of course.
No.
Of course they do. I mean, does it turn them into psychopathic killers? No. But does it influence their psyche in such a way that they are demoralized as a result? Yes, I think that's true. I think there's a cultural demoralization that has occurred across sectors. And and the shoot 'em up, assassin video games are brilliantly done. I mean, I've watched people play them. I've never played them myself because I've never been very good at them. I've never been very interested in them, but I do like watching other people who are very good at them play them. And because they almost run like little movies these days. I mean, I grew up in the days where it was like do, like it was not anything interesting. This is like three-dimensional animation. But of course, if you're spending hours a day in a virtual world where you're assassinating people and shooting them in the head, and the blood spills out and it's virtually realistic, that's going to have an effect on your psyche.
Yeah,
You're going to be less humane as a result.
right. And I feel like anytime there is like a mass shooting of some kind, the media goes back to the video game. So that's why I kind of focused more so on the video game or use that analogy or wording.
It works. I think you're right. It works as an analogy. I
Right.
don't think it works as a correlative. I don't think it works as a causative. It's not a direct point one from the other, but it is part of a bigger cultural picture that is absolutely informing everything that happens.
Right. Um, why are loner boys susceptible or to being grounded into or grouped into a category suspect in terms of the book?
Any loner is suspect.
Okay.
I mean, if we're communal beings, right? We're human beings. I mean, less and less these days because the internet has, and the lockdowns and this odd authoritarian thrust in governments across the world. It's not just here. There is a strange isolation that we're experiencing right now. Communities have been more or less decimated. I mean, I'm sure there are still people who actively fight to have their community, but churches been more or less dissolved. Um, Recreation centers have been more or less dissolved. Schools are more or less not dissolved, but eviscerated. They don't have the guts of community that they used to have. And so people's investment in one another has really taken a hit. And so loner boys, loner girls, loner men, loner women, I mean, that's pretty much the modus operandi for people in the world today, especially in more advanced Western countries, because the technology facilitates the isolation, and we're all addicted to the technology because it also facilitates every other aspect of our lives. But I think initially the loner boy, I mean, of course you're going to be suspicious of the person who's walking off on their own with their head down and their hood over their head. What are they thinking about? Why it's an antisocial question, I think. There's an antisocial part of the loner boy, and that could be because he has a certain genius that makes it difficult for him, or a certain affliction that makes it very difficult for him to socialize, or it could be because has psychopathic inclinations. But the
Yeah.
percentage of psychopathy is like 1%. So the chances of the loner boy, the incel, being a threat to society is actually pretty low, even though they look somewhat off-putting. That doesn't mean that they are a threat, and more often than not, they're not a threat. I
Great.
mean, the boys in the chat room are all of those wannabes who are not a threat, but kind of fantasize that they were. But a lot of people, and think I say this in the book, that most men fantasize about being a monster. Men, a lot of people, men and women, sometimes have monstrous fantasies, whatever it is, like ruling the world, or um, dominating a certain field or being the most popular kid at school. I mean, these have a kind of monstrosity built into them because it puts you up above everyone else, and that is inherently an antisocial, inhumane desire to be regaled above all. But I think most people just have the adolescent fantasy of that. They're not actually looking to have that experience.